Let's go to another example of ill-informed journalists attempting to dictate what information you, the public, is allowed to have. Last week, the ABC's Paul Barry went on a crusade calling out media outlets, including the ABC, which dared to report on AstraZeneca vaccine-related deaths. Barry made the case that it was alarmism to report links between vaccines and deaths, and made the bold claims that journalists accurately reporting these incidents were being irresponsible and spreading anxiety.
If you're looking to blame anyone for Australians' fear of the AstraZeneca jab, it's hard to go past our politicians. But media reporting of the risks involved has been relentless. And by late April, after 3 more non-fatal cases highlighted by the media, the public were giving the AZ vaccine the big thumbs down. And some of those headlines in response to changing vaccine advice were surely over the top. Too often, the media's attention has focused on the negative. So why has the country and some of the media become so risk-averse and spread so much anxiety about a jab that should save lives?
Barry didn't stop there, though. He went on to highlight a very specific case of reporting by both the ABC and the West Australian that informed the public a woman in her 60s had died after getting the AstraZeneca vaccine. Neither the ABC or the West Australian said that the vaccine was the cause, only pointed out the fact that her death was now being investigated by the Therapeutic Goods Administration.
While we're talking alarmism, what about these stories from the ABC and the West Australian 10 days ago? About a woman in her 60s who died in a Perth hospital after receiving a COVID vaccine weeks earlier, which then conceded the death was not linked to a blood clot and that, in fact, the woman did not have a blood clot before she died.
So Dr. Paul Barry seemed to have made his mind up. The only problem is that Barry was entirely wrong, and this week had to deliver a grovelling apology to his own company, the West Australian, and had to share his sympathies with the family of the deceased after using this poor woman as a tool in his campaign against the truth.
Last week we hoed into the ABC and West Australian for stories linking the death of a Perth woman who did not have a blood clot to the AstraZeneca vaccine. The TGA is still investigating, but now believes the woman's death was likely linked to the vaccine, due to a very rare blood disorder which can cause excessive bleeding. Our apologies to the ABC and West Australian, and our sympathies to the family.
Yes, that's right. The TGA believes it is likely the vaccine played a role in this woman's death. And the problem is not just how Barry handled this specific case. His attitudes are reflective of a broader culture among some in Australian media that news stories must be filtered before being published. I thought the role of a journalist was to accurately reflect reality, not to bubble wrap the difficult conversations. While the risk of dying from an AstraZeneca vaccine is very low, the risk does exist, and I personally think it is disingenuous to ignore that fact. It also gives conspiracy theorists something to latch onto. When they say the media is covering up vaccine deaths, they can use Barry's misinformation as evidence and use it to try and legitimise false claims. If Barry wants journalists to ignore certain news stories, then he is part of the problem. And don't take my word for it, Barry agrees with me.
But it's also what the media choose to focus on and what they neglect that creates a problem.
Sophie, it's a rare apology from Paul Barry. It's good that he did it, so kudos to him. But it is kind of indicative of that culture that you can't report certain things that the ABC or people like Paul Barry don't want you to report.
Oh, look, Jack, wasn't that just a beautiful moment in television where Paul Barry had to issue a grovelling apology? I mean, as you said, that's incredibly rare. But this is a very important story and people deserve to know this information. We know, Jack, there's a lot of concerns around the vaccines and there has been issues relating to blood clots causing death. So I think it's incredibly dangerous to hide this information, or as you put it beautifully, Jack, filter it out so that we're not telling people about this. People deserve to know all sides of the story, not just what, you know, journalists or media outlets want information to be out there. They should know the full story.
And James, why does Paul Barry get to be the one to decide what conversations we're allowed to have? Would you like Paul Barry to censor your particular discourse?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, watching that and thinking about all the issues and watching Paul Barry there and watching his apology, you know, a lot of thoughts came to mind. One of them being, for over $1 billion a year, that's the best shirt they could get Paul Barry. But other things also come to mind as well. And yes, you know, Sophie is absolutely right. People deserve to know everything that's happening with this vaccine, with, you know, are there harms, are there dangers? But of course, that reporting should also point out, you know, all the other things that are risky in our lives, because we don't want to become risk averse. The question of whether Paul Barry is the man to be the arbiter of what we should and shouldn't report and what people are allowed and not allowed to know, though, that's where things get really problematic. I mean, I'm thinking about how in another story with this whole pandemic, where it came from, Paul Barry was the #1 tone policer in Australia when it came to the questions of, did this thing perhaps get generated in this lab where they were studying bat coronaviruses that this thing seems to have evolved out of in the city where the pandemic seems to have originated. And of course, Paul Barry devoted a number of Media Watch episodes to not talking about, to shutting down, saying people should not talk about those sorts of things, saying it was wrong and everything else. And now, of course, the rest of the world has now come around to the conclusion that people like Sherry Marks and that newspapers like the Daily Telegraph and the Australian and outlets around the world have come to, which is that this thing very likely did start in a lab. And with people like Paul Barry saying, no, you can't talk about that, well, then we would never know the truth about that. And we'd be listening to Xi Jinping saying, oh, you know, who knows where it came from? It may have come from some, you know, frozen goods sent to Wuhan by America or something like that. So, you know, this issue, this is the whole problem with that sort of policing, is you cannot have anybody really in a free society saying what you can and cannot say. There should not be guardrails like that.